The rain tapped lightly against the window, steady but not yet threatening. I stood in the kitchen, holding a half-empty mug of coffee that had gone cold while I wasn't paying attention. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, and the air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The weather report said a storm was coming, a big one. I glanced at the list I'd scribbled on a notepad. Batteries, candles, bottled water, canned food. I'd prepared for storms before. This one didn't seem different, but something about the day felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Ryan walked into the kitchen, his phone in hand, staring down at it like he was hypnotized. He muttered a "hey" as he sat down at the table without looking at me. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You okay?" "Huh? Yeah, just work stuff," he said quickly, still scrolling. He angled his phone slightly, like he didn't want me to see. It wasn't the first time I'd caught him doing that lately. I leaned against the counter, watching him for a moment. "Anything I can help with?" I asked. He shook his head without looking up. "Nope, it's fine." That knot in my stomach tightened, but I pushed it down. Ryan could be distant sometimes, especially when work stressed him out. Still, he'd been acting strange lately. Distracted, quiet. I wasn't sure if it was something he wasn't telling me, or if I was just imagining things. Either way, I hated the uneasiness that was starting to creep in. "Well," I said, turning back to my list, "I'm heading out to grab a few things before the storm hits. Do you need anything?" "No," he said quickly, glancing up for the first time. "I'm good. Just be careful out there." "Sure," I said with a small smile, though he'd already gone back to his phone. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The rain was light but steady, the kind that soaks into your skin without you realizing it. The town was alive with quiet activity, neighbors pulling in patio furniture, taping windows, and making hurried trips to their cars. I waved to Mrs. Hale next door as she struggled with a tarp for her flower beds. "Storm's coming in fast," she called out, smiling but looking a little frazzled. "Yeah," I said. "Stay safe." The drive to the store was uneventful, but the aisles were crowded. People rushed around, filling their carts like it was the end of the world. I grabbed the essentials, double-checking my list to make sure I hadn't missed anything. But my mind wasn't on the groceries. It was on Ryan. He'd been so distant lately, and those late-night work calls hadn't helped my growing suspicion. I didn't want to be the kind of wife who overthought everything, but it was hard not to when he barely talked to me anymore. By the time I got home, the rain had picked up, and the wind was starting to howl. I carried the bags inside, dripping water on the floor. Ryan was still at the table, staring at his phone. He didn't even look up. For a moment, I thought about asking him again if something was wrong. But instead, I set the groceries down and quietly started putting them away. The storm was coming, and I had a feeling it wasn't just outside. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time I finished putting the groceries away. The house felt quiet, too quiet. "Ryan," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you think we should start securing the windows? The storm's getting worse." He didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, and his brow furrowed like he was reading something serious. Then his phone rang, breaking the silence. He stood up abruptly and turned his back to me as he answered. "Hello?" His tone shifted, soft but tense. I couldn't hear the other person on the line, but the way his shoulders stiffened told me it wasn't work. I leaned against the counter, waiting for him to finish. Instead, he started pacing. "Clara, what's going on?" he said, his voice dropping lower. My stomach dropped with it. Clara, I hadn't heard her name in years, but it was a name I hadn't forgotten. Ryan's ex, the one he'd once thought he'd marry before she disappeared from his life. "Wait, slow down," Ryan continued. "You're where? At home? Okay, just stay calm." The rain pounded harder against the windows as I watched him. He glanced at me briefly, then turned away, lowering his voice. "It's fine. I'll figure something out. Just hang tight." When he hung up, I couldn't keep quiet. "Was that Clara?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," he said, running a hand through his hair. "She's in trouble. She says she's stuck in her house. The water's rising, and she doesn't know what to do." I stared at him, trying to process. "And you're going to her?" "She doesn't have anyone else, Mia," he said, grabbing his jacket. "I can't just leave her there." The disbelief hit me like a wave. Ryan, there's a storm outside. It's dangerous. You don't even know how bad it is out there yet. I'll be fine, he said, brushing past me toward the door. I'll just check on her, make sure she's okay. Ryan, please, I said, stepping in front of him. You don't need to do this. You barely even talk to her anymore. What about us? What about me? He stopped just for a second and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Guilt? Frustration? I wasn't sure. Mia, I'm sorry, but I can't just ignore this. And with that, he pushed past me, opening the door to the storm. The wind howled as the rain whipped against him, but he didn't hesitate. He didn't even look back. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching him disappear into the rain. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, the sound of the storm drowning out the voice in my head that kept asking, "What about me?" The sound of the rain had shifted. It wasn't just heavy anymore. It was relentless, pounding against the windows like fists. The wind howled, shaking the old frames, and the faint wail of evacuation sirens pierced through the chaos. My heart raced as I stood by the window, watching the water creep closer to the porch. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a message from Ryan, anything to let me know he was okay. But the screen was blank, except for the emergency alert flashing at the top. Severe flooding. Evacuate to higher ground immediately. Higher ground? I muttered, glancing around the house. The closest shelter was miles away, and with Ryan gone, I had no car. The water reached the porch steps, swirling with debris. My stomach tightened. I ran to the closet and grabbed a flashlight, throwing it into a bag with some essentials: bottled water, my phone charger, and a jacket. I felt clumsy, my hands shaking as I tried to think of what else I'd need. A loud creak came from outside, followed by a crash. I ran to the window and saw part of the old oak tree in the yard snap and fall into the rising water. My heart sank. This wasn't just a bad storm, it was a disaster. I turned back toward the kitchen to grab more supplies, but then I felt it. Cold water lapped at my ankles. I froze, staring down at the growing puddle on the floor. The water wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside. Stay calm, Mia, I whispered to myself, stepping back. I needed to leave, and fast. I grabbed my bag and headed for the front door, but as I opened it, a wall of water surged in, knocking me off balance. I fell hard, the cold shocking me as the current pushed me backward. Panic clawed at my chest as I scrambled to my feet, water now up to my knees. I couldn't stay here. The house wasn't safe anymore. I stumbled toward the stairs, desperate for a plan. My shoes were soaked, and every step felt like dragging weights through the flood. The sound of breaking glass made me whip around. The living room window shattered, letting more water rush in. It was rising faster than I thought possible, already halfway up the walls. The realization hit me like a slap. I couldn't wait for Ryan or anyone else. I had to save myself. I forced myself to focus, shoving the fear aside. I grabbed a chair and used it to break open the attic hatch. Climbing up was harder than I expected, my soaked clothes clinging to me and making every movement sluggish. Once inside, I slammed the hatch shut behind me and crawled to the far corner, trying to catch my breath. The sirens outside grew fainter, drowned out by the storm's roar. Trapped in the attic with the water rising below, I clenched my fists, muttering to myself, "You're not going to drown here. You can't." The air outside felt different, thick with moisture and buzzing with tension. The rain didn't just fall, it attacked in sheets, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. I stepped off the porch and into the floodwaters, the icy chill sending a shock through my body. The current tugged at my legs, threatening to pull me off balance with every step. I gripped the flashlight tightly, scanning for anything solid to hold on to. Tree branches, garbage cans, even entire fences floated by, carried by the rushing water. Every step felt like a gamble. My sneakers were already soaked through, and the weight of the water dragged at my every movement. I turned onto the main road, or at least where I thought it was. The water had swallowed everything. Streets, sidewalks, yards, all blending into one endless expanse. The shelter was supposed to be up on Highland Street, but it felt miles away. I took another step, and suddenly my foot slipped on something hidden below the surface. "Ah!" I cried out as I fell, landing hard on my side in the water. Pain shot through my leg, sharp and immediate. I sat there for a moment, the cold seeping into my bones. my breath coming in ragged gasps. My flashlight bobbed a few feet away, half submerged but still glowing weakly. I reached for it, biting back tears as the movement sent another jolt of pain through my leg. Get up, Mia! You don't have time to sit here. I forced myself to my feet, leaning heavily on a nearby mailbox for support. My leg throbbed with every step, but I couldn't stop. The water seemed higher now, pushing harder against me. Each step felt like a battle. As I limped forward, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Relief surged through me. I fumbled to pull it out, hoping it was Ryan, but when I saw the screen, my stomach sank. It was just another emergency alert about the flooding. My fingers hovered over his contact for a moment before I hit call. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Come on, Ryan, I whispered. Pick up. Voicemail. I bit my lip, trying to keep the tears at bay. Of course he's not answering. He was probably with Clara, playing the hero while I was out here fighting for my life. The thought sent a wave of anger through me, momentarily drowning out the fear. Pushing forward, I clung to anything I could find for support. Lampposts, fences, even floating debris. My injured leg slowed me down, each step more excruciating than the last. The rain pelted my face, cold and unrelenting, and the water crept higher, now up to my thighs. Ahead, the faint glow of a street lamp flickered in the distance. It was a sign of higher ground, a small victory in the chaos. Gritting my teeth, I pushed forward, determined not to give up. Even if no one else cared, I would fight to save myself. The water was relentless, cold, and unforgiving. Every step felt heavier, my injured legs screaming in protest. The street lamp I'd been aiming for seemed farther away with each passing moment, and the water was rising faster than I could move. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as the current tugged at my legs, threatening to drag me under. Just a little further, I whispered to myself, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. My arms flailed out to grab onto something, anything, to keep me steady. My fingers found a piece of floating wood, and I clung to it like a lifeline. My body was trembling, half from exhaustion, and half from the icy water soaking through every inch of me. My vision blurred as the rain lashed against my face. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard voices, faint and muffled by the storm. But I couldn't be sure. Maybe it was just the wind, mocking me as I struggled to stay upright. Then, it happened. A sharp jolt of pain shot through my back as something heavy struck me. Debris swept up by the flood. The impact sent me sprawling, face first into the water. Panic set in as I gasped, swallowing a mouthful of the murky floodwater. I managed to push myself up just enough to cough and sputter, but my strength was fading fast. My hands fumbled for the wood I'd been holding, but it was gone, carried away by the current. I tried to get back on my feet, but my legs refused to cooperate. The cold had seeped deep into my muscles, leaving them stiff and unresponsive. Help! My voice was barely a whisper, lost in the roar of the storm. I collapsed again, my body sinking into the water as my head hit the edge of a submerged signpost. The world spun, and the voices I thought I'd heard earlier seemed louder now, though they felt impossibly far away. I tried to lift my head, but the weight of exhaustion and pain was too much. Through the haze, I saw beams of light piercing through the darkness. Flashlights. My heart leapt for a moment, hope flickering faintly. Rescuers, they were here. They were calling out, their voices urgent and commanding, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Over here! I tried to shout, but the words caught in my throat. My hand twitched, the only part of me that seemed to move. The lights drew closer, and I thought I saw a figure wading through the water toward me, but it was too late. The pain in my back and the cold pressing against my chest became too much. My eyelids fluttered, heavy and unyielding, as darkness swallowed me whole. The last thing I heard was the faint sound of splashing footsteps and someone shouting, "We've got one here," before everything went silent. I woke to the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the faint beep of a heart monitor. My eyes fluttered open, the blurry outlines of the hospital room slowly coming into focus. The ceiling was stark white, glaring and unfamiliar. I tried to move, to sit up, to lift my hand, but nothing happened. "Good, you're awake," a voice said softly. A nurse leaned into view, her face kind but serious. "You've been through a lot, Mia. Try not to move too much. I wanted to ask what had happened, but when I opened my mouth, only a faint croak came out. My throat felt like sandpaper, raw and dry. She gently adjusted the bed so I was slightly upright and held a cup of water with a straw to my lips. The water was cold and soothing, but it didn't ease the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I know this is overwhelming, the nurse continued, her tone cautious. You were found in the flood. There was debris. It caused significant trauma to your spine. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to process what she was saying, but it felt like my mind was moving in slow motion. You've suffered a spinal cord injury, she explained. The doctors have determined it's severe. For now, you're paralyzed from the neck down. Paralyzed! The word echoed in my head, sharp and relentless. I wanted to scream, cry, anything, but my body betrayed me. All I could do was lie there, still and useless, as the reality of her words sank in. The door creaked open, and I turned my eyes toward it, the only part of me that seemed to work. Ryan stepped in hesitantly, his face pale and drawn. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief. He was here. Maybe everything wasn't as bad as it seemed. But then he spoke. Mia, he began, his voice trembling. I don't even know what to say. Why? The words scraped out of my throat, raw and accusing. He looked down, avoiding my gaze. Clara called. She said she was in trouble. I couldn't ignore her. I thought you'd be okay. My heart sank. Clara. Of course. It was always Clara. She needed me, Mia, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know this would happen. I stared at him, my eyes burning with unshed tears. He couldn't even look at me as he confessed, his guilt wrapped tightly around his shoulders like a cloak. But guilt wasn't enough. His words, his excuses, only deepened the ache in my chest. You left me? I whispered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. You chose her. He tried to take my hand, but I couldn't feel it. Couldn't pull away. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. But sorry wasn't enough. Not this time. The weeks blurred together in a haze of despair and endless silence. Every day the routine was the same. Nurses, therapists, more nurses. They adjusted my bed, fed me, spoke in soft tones about progress that felt meaningless. I stared out the hospital window, watching the world move on without me. My body felt like a cage, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. Ryan stopped visiting after a while. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was Clara. Either way, his absence hurt almost as much as his choice to leave me in that storm. I played the memory on a loop in my head, the rain pouring down, his hurried footsteps as he rushed to her, leaving me to fend for myself. It was a wound that refused to heal. The nurses spoke of therapy, hope, finding new ways to live. But I couldn't see a future beyond this bed. What kind of life was this? A life of dependence, pity, and the echoes of a betrayal I couldn't escape. I didn't want to be here anymore. One night when the hospital was quiet, I made up my mind. The electric wheelchair they'd given me had been sitting in the corner, untouched. They said it was for when I was ready to try independence, but the word felt like a cruel joke. I wasn't independent. I was a burden, a shadow of the person I used to be. But the chair gave me an idea. The plan was simple. The cliff overlooking the bay wasn't far from the hospital grounds. I'd been there before, back when life still had meaning, before everything fell apart. The thought of the wind on my face one last time, the ocean waiting below, felt like peace. It took effort to convince the night nurse to leave the chair in my room. I forced a smile, said I wanted to try using it tomorrow. She seemed genuinely pleased and rolled it to my bedside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When the clock struck midnight, I made my move. The chair hummed softly as I maneuvered it out of the room, down the dimly lit corridor, and out the emergency exit. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp, but alive. For a fleeting moment, I hesitated, wondering if this was the right choice. But then I remembered Ryan's face, the way he'd chosen Clara without hesitation, and the pain roared back to life. I followed the path to the cliff, the wheels of the chair crunching softly against the gravel. The moon lit the water below, shimmering like a promise. My heart raced, a mix of fear and relief. I whispered a goodbye to the night, to the pain, to everything. I pressed the joystick forward, ready to end it all. But just as the chair tilted over the edge, the world tilted too. A blinding light enveloped me, pulling me away from the darkness. The sound of birds chirping pulled me from the void. My eyes fluttered open, greeted by the soft morning light streaming through my bedroom window. For a moment, I thought I was still in the hospital, but the ceiling above me wasn't sterile and white. It was my own. My chest rose and fell with ease, and when I shifted, my arms moved naturally, freely. I bolted upright, hands trembling as I touched my legs. They were solid, strong. I swung them off the bed, planting my feet firmly on the floor. I was standing. Was this a dream? I spun in place, touching the walls, the nightstand, my reflection in the mirror. I looked like myself again, whole, unbroken. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone. The date read the same as it had on the morning of the storm. It couldn't be. Panic gripped me, but a strange sense of purpose followed. I wasn't in the hospital anymore. This wasn't a dream. I was back somehow, in the exact moment my life began to unravel. The storm, Ryan leaving, the flood, all of it was waiting ahead. But this time, I wouldn't let it happen the same way. The thought of Ryan burned in my chest, but it didn't sting like before. I didn't feel betrayed, I felt determined. This was my chance to rewrite everything. I wouldn't sit back and let his decisions dictate my life again. Whatever the second chance was, I wouldn't waste it. I glanced out the window, watching the early clouds roll in. I remembered the storm's path, the rising waters, the moment I was left alone. This time, I wouldn't be caught off guard. I wouldn't wait for someone to rescue me. I would save myself. First things first, I needed to prepare. I threw on a jacket and sturdy shoes, grabbing my car keys. I knew Ryan would get Clara's call soon and make his choice to leave me. Let him. I didn't need him anymore. I grabbed my emergency kit from the closet, throwing in extra water bottles and non-perishables I remembered needing last time. My heart raced as I packed, each motion deliberate, purposeful. The voice in my head, the one that used to doubt me, tell me I couldn't make it alone, was silent now, replaced with resolve. As I stepped outside, the rain had already started to fall, lightly at first but steady. I glanced at Ryan through the window, his phone lighting up with what I knew was Clara's name. I didn't stop him when he answered. Instead, I walked to my car, ready to face whatever the storm had in store for me. This time, I wouldn't let the flood define me. I would define it. The rain tapped against the windows as I laid out my plan on the dining table. A map of the town spread before me. Red ink circled the low-lying streets that would flood first. I remembered every moment from before. The way the water rose, the roads that turned into rivers. This time, I wouldn't be caught off guard. My emergency bag sat packed at my feet, filled with essentials: food, water, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I added my most important documents, sealing them in a waterproof bag, and tucked them inside. Every movement felt deliberate, calculated. The Mia from before, the one who waited, hoping for someone to save her, was gone. This Mia had a plan. My phone buzzed. It was Ryan pacing in the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. Even from the other side of the house, I could hear the urgency in his voice. I didn't need to guess who he was talking to. I sent him a text anyway. Ryan, the storm's getting worse. Stay here with me. We need to be together for this. For a moment, I thought he might listen. He looked at his phone, hesitating before glancing at the door. He went to grab his keys, but I already had taken the car keys. I wasn't going to let him take it this time. He searched for a bit, then decided to take off on his bike. He didn't even bother to respond. I sat back down at the table, gripping the edge tightly. His choice stung, but it didn't shatter me like before. It only solidified what I already knew. I couldn't rely on Ryan, and I didn't need to. The rain picked up, and the sirens began to wail, echoing through the town. I folded the map and tucked it into my bag, glancing around the house one last time. Everything felt so small, so insignificant compared to what was coming. The storm would wash it all away, and I didn't care. This house wasn't my anchor anymore. I was. I climbed into my car, my grip on the wheel steady as I backed out of the driveway. The rain pounded harder, blurring the windshield. but I knew where I was going. I had already mapped out the safest route to the emergency shelter on higher ground. As I drove, I glanced at my phone, half expecting a call or a text from Ryan, but it stayed silent, just like he had before. I turned it off, focusing on the road ahead. This time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me. The storm was already turning the streets into small rivers, water lapping at the tires. I navigated carefully, the weight of my decisions heavy, but freeing. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. Ryan had made his choice, and now I was making mine. I wasn't just surviving the storm, I was taking control of it. And nothing, not the flood, not Ryan, and certainly not my past, was going to stop me. The rain was relentless, hammering against the roof of my car as I carefully navigated the slick streets. Every time I passed a storm drain, water gushed out like a fountain, and the wind howled, shaking the car. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white. I wasn't afraid, not this time. I was focused, determined. I followed the route I had mapped earlier, keeping to the higher streets where the water wouldn't rise as quickly. The roads were eerily empty, most people either sheltering at home or still ignoring the severity of the storm. My headlights cut through the heavy rain, illuminating the debris scattered across the asphalt. Branches, garbage cans, even an overturned bike. Everything was going smoothly until I rounded a corner and saw it. A massive tree lying across the road, its roots ripped from the ground. The trunk sprawled over both lanes, its branches reaching like skeletal arms into the rising floodwaters. Great, I muttered, my breath fogging up the glass as I leaned closer to the windshield. I slammed the car into park and weighed my options. I could turn back and risk getting caught by rising waters in the lower streets, or I could find a way around this obstacle. The wind howled as I stepped out of the car, rain immediately soaking through my jacket. I waded toward the tree, the cold water swirling around my calves. It was impossible to move the trunk. It was far too heavy. But I could see a gap where the tree didn't quite meet the flooded curb. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for me to squeeze through. I sloshed back to the car, the water rising by the minute. "You can do this, Mia," I whispered to myself, gripping the steering wheel. With a deep breath, I turned the wheel and maneuvered toward the narrow gap. The car's tires splashed through the rising water, the engine grumbling as I eased forward. For a moment, I thought I'd made it. But as the tires rolled over submerged branches, the car lurched and stalled. Panic gripped me, but I shoved it down. I wasn't going to give up now. "Come on," I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared back to life. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't have time to celebrate. I pressed the gas pedal gently, inching the car through the gap until finally I was on the other side. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding. The rain continued to pour, the storm showing no signs of mercy. But I was still moving, still alive, and still in control. The shelter wasn't far now. The thought of it pushed me forward, one careful turn at a time. Whatever else the storm had in store, I was ready. This time, I wasn't just running from the flood, I was running toward my own survival. The wind screamed in my ears, carrying the storm's wrath as rain lashed against my face. The floodwaters had risen faster than I'd anticipated, turning the streets into rivers. I waded through knee-high water, every step a struggle against the fierce current. My soaked clothes clung to me, and each breath I took felt heavier than the last. I'd parked the car as high up the road as I could, but it became useless when the water surged up to the doors. I had no choice but to continue on foot. Each step forward felt like a battle. Suddenly, the current picked up. A surge of water struck me hard, sweeping my legs out from under me. I was yanked downstream, tumbling and flailing as I tried to grab onto anything to stop the momentum. My lungs burned as my head dipped below the surface. My arms flailed, fingers grasping at nothing but water. In the chaos, I caught sight of a car sticking out of the flood, a small sedan caught on the curb. With every ounce of strength I had, I lunged for it, my hands clawing at the roof rack. My fingers found purchase, and I clung to it like my life depended on it. Because it did. The current slammed against me, trying to tear me away, but I held on. My body ached, muscles trembling from the effort. Finally, the surge eased, and I hauled myself onto the hood of the car, coughing and gasping for air. For a moment, I just sat there, water dripping from my hair and clothes. my breaths coming in ragged gulps. The storm still raged around me, but I felt like I'd escaped the worst of it. For now. As I caught my breath, my thoughts began to spiral. How did I get here? Stranded in a flood, fighting to survive alone, while Ryan was... what? Probably holding Clara's hand, comforting her like she was the most important person in the world. The bitterness rose like bile in my throat. For years, I'd put Ryan first. I'd sacrificed my time, my energy, my happiness, all for him. I thought that's what love was, giving everything without expecting anything in return. But now, as I sat on that car hood, drenched and shaking, I realized how wrong I'd been. Ryan hadn't sacrificed for me. He hadn't even chosen me when it mattered most. And yet, I'd spent so much of my life trying to prove I was enough for him. Enough for someone who left me behind without a second thought. The rain continued to pour, the wind howling like it was mocking me. But something inside me shifted. I wasn't just fighting the storm anymore. I was fighting for myself. I wiped the water from my face, planted my feet on the submerged road, and stood up. My legs were shaky, but I forced them to move forward. The shelter wasn't far now, and I wasn't going to stop until I reached it. The rain hadn't let up, and the wind continued its relentless assault. My body was exhausted, but I pushed forward, one careful step at a time, the shelter drawing closer in my mind. I couldn't let myself stop now. I wouldn't. As I trudged through the rising water, I heard a faint voice, almost drowned out by the storm. I stopped, straining to listen. There it was again, a weak call for help. My heart raced as I scanned the area. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of a small convenience store partially submerged in the flood. "Hello?" I called out, moving toward the source of the voice. The rain stung my skin, and the water reached higher up my legs as I went. Finally, I spotted him, an elderly man perched on the roof of a submerged car, clutching a cane. His frail figure shook in the cold as he waved at me. "Please, I can't get down," he called out, his voice trembling. I didn't hesitate. My own fear took a back seat as I waded through the water toward him. The current tugged at me with every step, but I gritted my teeth and kept going. "Hang on, I'm coming," I shouted. When I reached the car, I realized the water was too deep for him to climb down safely on his own. I steadied myself against the car's frame and reached up. "Take my hand," I said, trying to sound calm despite the storm raging around us. He hesitated, his eyes full of fear. "I'm too old for this. I'll fall." "You won't," I assured him, meeting his gaze. "I've got you." It took a few tries, but eventually I managed to help him down. His grip on my hand was weak, but his trust in me gave me strength. Once we were both on solid ground, I wrapped his arm around my shoulder to support him. "There's higher ground just ahead," I said. "Can you walk?" He nodded shakily. "I'll try." We moved slowly, the water sloshing around our knees, as I guided him to a small hill that rose above the flood. It wasn't much, but it was safe. For now. Once we were there, I sat him down on a dry patch of concrete and draped my jacket over his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought no one would come." I smiled, though my heart ached for him. "You're safe now. I'll stay with you until help arrives." As we waited, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The storm still raged, but for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. Helping this man had reminded me of something I'd forgotten during all the years of neglect and betrayal. My strength didn't come from others. It came from me. I glanced at the elderly man, now resting peacefully, and realized I wasn't just surviving the storm. I was reclaiming my life. I was drenched, aching, and so tired I could barely feel my legs anymore. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was so close. The rain pounded against my face, and the wind howled in my ears, but I pushed forward, the faint glow of the evacuation shelter's lights shimmering in the distance. "There it is," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the storm. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The shelter might have been in sight, but between me and safety was a treacherous stretch of waterlogged terrain. The road ahead was broken up by debris, fallen power lines, abandoned cars, and chunks of wood that had been torn from nearby buildings. Each step forward felt like wading through quicksand, the floodwaters tugging at me with every move. I stumbled, falling to my knees, the freezing water soaking through my clothes. For a moment, I thought about staying there, letting the current take me. What was the point of fighting anymore? The thought of Ryan choosing Clara over me flashed through my mind, and I felt a wave of bitterness rise in my chest. No, I said out loud, gripping the edge of a nearby car for support. Not like this! I stood up, wobbling but determined. I didn't know what would happen when I reached that shelter, but I wasn't about to let this storm defeat me. I thought of the elderly man I had helped earlier, the way his face had lit up with relief. If I could find the strength to save him, I could find the strength to save myself. The rain felt like needles on my skin as I trudged onward. The glow of the shelter grew brighter, but the last stretch of road was a nightmare. The ground was uneven and slick with mud, and I slipped more than once. My hands and knees were scraped raw, and my breaths came in ragged gasps. At one point, I tripped over a piece of metal and fell hard, my palms stinging as I caught myself. I screamed in frustration, tears mixing with the rain on my face. Why does it have to be so hard? I yelled into the void, my voice breaking. But then I looked up and saw it. The shelter, just a few 100 feet away. The thought of warm food, dry clothes, and safety gave me a surge of energy. I imagined walking into that building, not as the broken woman Ryan had left behind, but as someone stronger, someone who had survived the impossible. With a deep breath, I forced myself to stand. One foot in front of the other, I climbed through the debris, the shelter growing larger with every step. My body was on autopilot, fueled by sheer willpower. When I finally reached the entrance, I collapsed onto the steps, gasping for air. People rushed to help me, their voices a blur. I had made it. I had survived. And for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. I didn't know what I expected to find when I stepped into the shelter, but the sight of Ryan sitting next to Clara, holding her hand like she was the only person in the world, felt like a punch to the gut. My soaked clothes clung to me, my scraped knees stung, and my body ached from fighting against the storm. But none of that compared to the sharp sting of seeing him there, alive and well, while I had nearly died trying to save myself. I took a deep breath and walked closer, ignoring the curious glances from the other evacuees. Ryan turned his head, and for a moment his eyes widened in shock when he saw me. Clara stiffened beside him, her hand still resting in his. "Mia," Ryan said, standing up abruptly. "You're here!" "Yes, I'm here," I replied, my voice calm despite the turmoil inside me. "Barely." He looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled state. "What happened to you? Are you okay?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of his concern. "What happened to me? Really, Ryan? You left me in the middle of a storm to go save her?" I nodded toward Clara, who had the decency to look uncomfortable. "What do you think happened to me?" Ryan ran a hand through his wet hair, guilt flashing across his face. "Clara was in danger. She called me. You didn't even think about me," I interrupted, my voice rising. "You left me alone in a flood to save her. Do you have any idea what I went through today? The streets were underwater. I was swept away. I almost didn't make it here, Ryan. And where were you? Sitting here, holding her hand?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," he stammered. "I thought you'd be safe at home." "You thought wrong," I snapped, cutting him off again. "But you didn't care enough to check, did you? I begged you to stay, and you left anyway. I've always known you had a soft spot for Clara, but today you made it crystal clear where I stand." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "Don't! You've taken enough from me already." Ryan took a step closer, his voice pleading. "Mia, please. I made a mistake. I was trying to do the right thing." "The right thing?" I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping me. "The right thing would have been staying with your wife, but you didn't, and that decision cost us everything." Tears welled up in Ryan's eyes. "I can fix this. Just come home, and we'll talk." "No," I said firmly. "There's nothing to fix. I almost died today. And in that moment, I realized something important. I deserve better. I deserve someone who doesn't make me feel like an afterthought." Ryan's shoulders slumped, and Clara looked away. Without another word, I turned and walked away, feeling lighter with every step. It was time to leave the storm behind. For good. Ryan caught up with me just outside the shelter. His voice was strained, desperate. Mia, wait, please just let me explain. I stopped, turning slowly to face him. The rain had eased into a drizzle, but the storm inside me still raged. His face was pale, his wet hair clinging to his forehead, and for the first time in years, I noticed something. He looked small, not the confident, supportive husband I once believed him to be, but someone who had always put himself first, dressed up in excuses and half-hearted apologies. Explain? I said, crossing my arms. Explain what, Ryan? That you prioritized Clara over me? That you left me in a storm to fend for myself because she needed you? Go ahead. I'd love to hear how you justify it. I wasn't thinking straight, he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. She called, and I panicked. She sounded terrified, and I didn't know what to do. I thought you'd be safe at home. I stared at him, unblinking. Safe at home? Did you even consider calling to check on me? Did it even cross your mind that I might need help too? Ryan hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. I thought you'd be fine, he muttered, his voice barely audible. You thought wrong, I said, the steel in my voice surprising even me. I wasn't fine, Ryan. I almost died today. I fell, I got hurt, and I was swept away by floodwaters. I fought for my life out there, alone. Do you have any idea what that feels like? I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I made a mistake. I see that now. Please, Mia, I can make it right. Just come home and we'll figure this out together. I shook my head, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. No, Ryan, we won't. This isn't something you can fix with an apology or by saying you'll do better. Today wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. You chose Clara over me. You chose to abandon your wife in the middle of a disaster. Mia, don't do this, he pleaded, stepping closer. I love you. No, you don't, I said firmly, meeting his eyes. If you loved me, you wouldn't have left me. You wouldn't have put me in a position where I had to fight to survive while you played the hero for someone else. Ryan looked crushed, but I didn't feel sorry for him. For years, I had bent over backward to make him happy, to be the wife he needed. But what had he ever done for me? Today, the answer was clear. Not enough. I'm done, Ryan, I said, my voice steady. I'm done putting myself last. I deserve someone who values me, who puts me first. And if I can't find that, I'll be just fine on my own. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the rain. This time, I wasn't looking back.